I'm back, and I'm wearing the same clothes because it's the same day as when I filmed the last episode, and it's not because I'm gross and never changed my clothes. It just legitimately, actually, I can't show you this because it's over there, but my computer over there is actually working on rendering the video that I just shot. Now I'm shooting number 2 for today. It'll be shorter, but I'm just kind of in the mood and I'm like, I got momentum to record something. And so I thought, well, what else can I talk about that I would feel kind of like prepared to talk about, and wouldn't just be a shot in the dark. And then I thought, let's do a defensive shooting in the dark. So I have my notes over here, and that's why they're up on a whiteboard. I'm in my classroom. You can tell because there's desks everywhere. But I'll be looking up at the board occasionally to get my bearings on where I'm at. And I think, gut reactions, off the cuff statements, shooting in the dark, these kinds of things. As I want to do maybe an apology for them. And I think, well, there's a few reasons. So one of the reasons that I think it's actually worth not denigrating them. I don't want to. A gut reaction is not a reasoned reaction. I guess that's what I mean here, is when you just have sort of an immediate thought to something or an immediate reaction to something, and you haven't yet stopped to ponder the import of what you've just experienced and what your reaction should be. And I don't want to make it sound like these are better than a reasoned response. But I don't think they're so base as to warrant contempt or disgust or anything like that. I think there's actually a big use for them. Part of it is because, or they're just different from reason. They're, in a sense, they're the opposite of reason. They're irrational. And that's different. It's a different way of interacting with the world. Reason is good. Reason is not everything. It is good, but it's not everything. And when we take a good thing and we pretend that it's everything, we start to use it in ways that reveal that it's not always a good thing, or at least there are situations where applying it is worse than applying something else. A hammer is a great tool until you need to put a screw into a board. The hammer is not good at putting a screw in the board, even though it still is a good tool. And reason is like that. It's good, and it's very good. And in fact, it's one of the highest actions that we can take. But it's not the only high action we can take. It's not the only way to interact with the world. And there are times when reason actually breaks down, or at least reason has limits. Reason doesn't handle everything very well. It handles lots of things very well, but not everything. And that initial gut reaction to something can sometimes be really revealing. It can show you things that you would not have thought of. If you had sat there and had a reasoned response was the first thing. Or if you were trying to think, well, okay, what's my reaction going to be? Sometimes your gut reaction really does tell you a lot about what's going on inside of you, which is good, because if you're going to respond to something, it's you who's doing the responding. And so really knowing you, knowing yourself, and knowing where you're coming from is really important if you're going to reason through and prepare a response. But it also can tell you, if you know who you are and you know what kinds of things you value, and if you know the world, and if you understand good and evil, and you understand these sorts of things, a gut reaction can be really revealing, both about you, but also about the world, about what's going on. If you're the kind of person who generally understands, say, football, and something happens in a game, and your immediate gut reaction is like, oh, I don't know if that's legal in the game of football. You might not know all the rules to football, but you've got to feel, you understand football, pretty well. And so you can kind of tell when things are off. And that's different from reason. And it's really useful because, football, I'll pick on football here. It's real hard to know all of the rules of football and all of the things they cover and the really specific stuff. Having a gut feeling for football is actually really useful for a ref even, because you learn the kinds of things that are usually not okay in the game. And this, let's apply this to sort of a bigger situation. When you're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, or a moral action or something like that, it's really hard to sit there and reason through fully every single situation that you're ever going to be in. In fact, it's not really possible. And so developing a good instinct, a good gut reaction to things, you're not going to bat 1,000 on gut reactions, but if you have formed your conscience and you've formed your intellect and you've formed these things well over years of reason and thinking about the good and the evil and coming to conclusions and playing out these situations and these sorts of stuff, you can develop a good feel for right and wrong in a way that is really useful. It'll get you through most situations. It reminds me kind of Kant's got his sort of categorical imperative. And he says, if it's not okay for everyone to do, then it's not okay for anyone to do. And this works a lot of the time. It's not perfect. It doesn't handle every situation perfectly well, but it works pretty good as far as, fairness, and it doesn't necessarily tell you whether something's morally good or not perfectly well. But even if something's morally acceptable, that doesn't mean you have to do it. It doesn't mean you think it's the right thing to do. It just means it's not the wrong thing to do, and that's subtly different. And Kant's moral imperative or categorical imperative does decent at stopping you from doing things you probably shouldn't do. So it's we might say a rule of thumb or a touchstone. Whereas when you get into a more complicated moral situation, you might think, okay, well, I need to, this one I have to think about, more so. But having a good gut reaction is good for that. I'll talk about, I guess, a little bit, there's a difference between something being irrational, like contrary to reason, and something being super rational or extra rational, where it's just different from reason. I'm never going to praise something for being irrational, for something being against reason. That's not good. But there are things that are outside of reason and even above reason. This isn't the video to get into those in a deep way. But it's, that's just, I guess, side convo. Here's a little aside about things just to, I guess, give us more words for things. I think it's also good as when we talk about the difference between like initiative and receptive realities. And gut reactions are very initiative. They start the process. It's actually good to let them happen because they can lead to reason. Even when they're different from reason, or even if we think in a certain situation this is better than starting with reason, it often leads to reason, and that's one of its good aspects. Is it can spark the mind into asking a question and saying, well, wait a second, what goes on here? And that leads to thinking, that prompts things. Famously, we talk about philosophy always begins in wonder. It always begins as a spark. It's something happens that makes you go, wait a second. What's going on? How does all of this work? How does this fit into, what is reality? What's the truth here? And that kind of thinking is what begins philosophy. If you don't have that, you won't pursue philosophy. People, I guess there's a difference between studying philosophy and then doing philosophy. Studying philosophy and doing philosophy. You can study philosophy without caring. You can study anything without caring. You can't do philosophy without caring. And caring starts as a gut reaction. That gut reaction is really good, that initiative thought. And then by reason, you have reason sort of receptive. It receives that impulse and then it chews on it. And it can itself then become initiative, where you now have a principle, a reasoned principle that came from this gut reaction, a reasoned principle that you apply to the next situation. And you start to build an idea of how the world works. And you, in a sense, one of the good parts of reason is that it leads to better and better gut reactions. Gut reactions are good because they lead to reason. Reason is good because it gives you better and better gut reactions for the next time something like that happens. And so here's, I guess, an epistemological defense of gut reactions, and how kind of what's their place? How do they work? How do they work with reason, and how do they get us from point A to point B? And a short little apology while my other video renders. Actually, it looks like it's done. And so this is a much shorter episode than the other one. But there we go. That's Mr. K thinking about gut reactions.